Smooth. What? So there's this rumor going around that writing requires talent. And while I'd love to beat my own drum, it's not entirely true. I could make a lot of jokes at this point about talentless writers succeeding, but I really won't. What I will say is that hard work, or at least persistent work, can quite often take the place of some kind of innate talent for storytelling. And perhaps nothing symbolizes hard work in writing as much as the idea of a draft. Now, you've probably heard about this before, perhaps even written drafts for different things in school and the like, but a draft in writing is actually a very powerful tool. Now, the basics are simple. You write a story, and then you look over what you've written, and then you try to write it a bit better based on that. But there is so much more that a draft can do for you during your writing. For one, it can set your mind at ease. This is a psychological trick more than anything, but knowing that what you're writing is a draft makes it easier for you to write. It makes yourself less critical of everything you do. Writer's block, as I've discussed before, is usually just a matter of not being very happy about what you've written, or not being very happy about what you're thinking of writing. You have a level of perfectionism, especially if it's a story that you're passionate about telling, and you want everything to be right from the get-go. It never, ever is. What you do instead is that you remind yourself that this is just a draft. You can write something better later if you're not satisfied. You can change everything and anything, and then you just write. That means what you're writing does not have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough that you can build on it. You're laying a foundation, and then you're laying the first floor, and the next floor, and the next floor. You're not building the penthouse in your first go. This is actually really important, because a lot of the difficult things to write, the kind of things that a lot of writers want to write but are having problems getting correct, require that you know your story fairly well in advance. If you've already written a draft, you have a pretty clear idea of what's going to happen. And when you write the next draft based on that, you can look to your previous draft and see what's going to happen down the line, so you can foreshadow things. You can have characters act in ways that will only make sense later on, because what happens later on is already written. In the previous draft, you have an idea of what's going to happen. This is usually very difficult to do if you're writing everything for the first time. But the way that you use drafts will also define a lot about how you write in general. There is this very black and white idea amongst many writers that writers are either pantsers or planners. Pantsers are the ones who write by the seat of their pants, hence the name, meaning that they just sit down and start writing the story without any previous plan. Now, a lot of people can do this very well. Either they are really good at making a plan in their head and following it, or they're very good at improvising on the spot. A lot of good stories can be written like that. The planners, however, plan the story out before writing even the first word. There are structures, there are models, there are techniques, methods, and everything that cover a lot of ways to plan your story in advance. I've mentioned the hero's journey before, and if you have the template for the hero's journey or the monomyth, you can actually put in the different scenes into that and simply write based on that. There are other ways to do it, but that's one good example. Now, in my opinion, and I must state that all of this, like the things I'm describing other people's do, is an opinion. Nothing more, nothing less. But pantsers versus planners is kind of, ironically, a piece of fiction. It's not that black and white. People aren't divided as easily along lines. It's a modern fad trying to make everything fit into a very narrow specific box. What you can do, however, when you're using drafts, is that you can write an early draft really, really bare bones, meaning you only have the plot set up. You only have the things that have to work. Nothing pretty, no prose, no great descriptions, no great characterizations, nothing other than what is absolutely needed to make the plot of the story work. And if your plot isn't that complicated, that can be very little. You can write it on the back of a piece of paper while you're sitting at your job. But you can write a story for an entire book in a few hundred words as your first draft, or maybe even second or third, depending on how tight you want the story to be. This is essentially what planners do. They write a very short version of their story before they write a longer one. But you can do even more than that. You can write the first story as a few hundred words on a piece of paper, just jot it down whenever you get the idea, and then you can write the second draft as a slightly longer version of that, adding characterization for the most important characters, adding secondary events that you feel matter more than most others, and then you can expand from that in the third draft, and you can build the story slowly. This is beyond planning. This is kind of the artist way to work. If you ever seen someone skilled at drawing, they will draw a very crude outline at first, then they'll fill in the bigger lines and then the smaller ones and then the details and so on, and they will build a picture more than drawing it in the first go. This is the same for a story. You make the story small at first so that you get the most important things down, and then you build on that bare bone skeleton. You add muscles and skin and whatever that metaphor includes. That of course means that there are a lot of methods that suddenly become available if you're the kind who wants to do several drafts. You should at least have 1 or 2 drafts before you write your final story. Unless you're really skilled at just sitting down and writing by the seat of your pants. But in that case, I think you do not need my advice. But if you do use drafts, you have the option of drafting characters, not just stories. You can draft characters, you can draft worlds. You can write a small library of stuff next to your story that will let you base your story more clearly on something. If you have 5 characters that matter a lot, 5 main characters or 5 characters of extreme interest, you can start out by drafting a description of each of those characters. And you can use that as reference once you get writing on the story. It can be at the first draft, it can be something later. You can do it for worlds, you can fit the whole story together from pieces that will never be in it. A whole background of the story, a behind the scenes look that will never be in the story itself, but it lets you craft a better story. Now as for myself, my method of drafting is kind of half one side, half the other side. What I usually do is I sit down and I write the entire story by the seat of my pants as the first draft. No greater thought put into deep details or foreshadowing or anything, just a story that I feel that I like. Once that first draft is done, I look the story over and I find out what were the pieces that I thought worked, what were the pieces that I really liked, and what was just filling, what was just me rambling. And then I sketch out the important parts. I sketch out the characters that I realized along the writing were important to me or interesting to me. I sketch out the part of the world that I thought mattered the most. And then I write the second draft. And the second draft usually shows me what kind of story I really want to write. The parts of the story that I didn't know in advance would fascinate me more to write than others. And in some cases, I do this more than once. After the second draft, maybe some other things came up that I wanted to sketch out in better detail before I do the third draft. Around the 4th or 5th draft, I usually have the story I want. But outside of the story itself, I usually also have a mass of information that helps me write things the best way I can, which helps me keep focus, which helps me keep the thoughts I like in the story, and helps me weed out the story parts that I don't really feel are going anywhere, that I don't really feel anything for. And yes, it can seem a bit extreme to actually write a full book just to have a first draft. Especially people who've never written a full book will probably think of this as an extreme expansion of their workload. But it actually helps a lot. The first drafts don't take as long because they're just that, they're drafts. It doesn't matter if they're not perfect. That means I can write at almost full speed. I can write a full novel in a month or 2. Some of you may know the NaNoWriMo contest, if you can call it that. The NaNoWriMo National Novel Writing Month. The challenge, I'd rather call it, where you write a novel in a month. And most novels you can actually see are written quite quickly, but that doesn't make them bad, it just makes them kind of unfinished. If a NaNoWriMo story was a first draft, you could build on it, or you could actually just polish it up and have a good story from that if you're lucky and if you're skilled at just writing from the seat of your pants. It's not impossible. Drafts are a tool, and it's up to every writer to decide how he or she will use that tool. but it has the psychological benefits of putting you at ease with writing because you know that what you write down is not necessarily the finished product. And it gives you a lot of possibilities for structuring a story better because you can draft out the first idea and you can figure out what works, what doesn't work. You can expand on things, you can take things out. It gives you a lot of control. And at least in my opinion, the quote-unquote extra work is definitely worth it. So if you haven't done it before, try to write a story and set a fixed number of drafts that you at least want to go through. Exaggerate if you want. It's a good way to train it. Tell yourself that you have to at least have 6 drafts of a story. It'll take longer, but you'll learn a lot about how to structure your story just from thinking about each draft after it's written. And be careful of one trap, which is that you get a lot of good ideas during a draft, and then you're tempted to just skip the whole thing and write the next draft immediately. Try not to do that. Note down your ideas, but finish the draft. Otherwise, you'll end up with a remarkably crafted first part of the book, and then it'll drop off because you wrote the first part several times but never finished the draft. So write a full draft, look it over, see what you want, write another draft, and so on. How long the drafts are, the word count, doesn't really matter. What matters is you get your story down and you build upon it. In fact, if you'll let me be a little bit meta here, what you're listening to now, what you're perhaps even watching, is a draft. Now, it might be a bit arrogant to publish something and still call it a draft, but like anyone else, I am learning. And these podcasts or videos, or whichever format you're watching or listening to this in, they are me learning how to do this. And later on, I'm probably going to, I think the current word is remaster what I'm doing now. I already have plans for it, but it's something down the line. I have to do it first, and then I can do it better later. That's how things work. You don't get the skills before you do something. You get the skills by doing something. So expect to hear this again at some point down the line. So have a happy writing.